there is a cardinal in your yard right now who has been preening for the last 20 minutes. You have probably seen this dozens of times. The beak running through the feathers, the head twisting at angles that look almost uncomfortable, the same wing being worked over and over again. You assumed it was about being clean. Almost everyone does. Subscribe to Bird Sense right now. This is exactly the kind of thing we uncover every week. Most people have been watching one of the most critical survival behaviors in a bird's entire existence and filing it under grooming, and what that cardinal is actually doing when it sits there running its beak through its feathers. That is what changes everything. To understand what he is actually doing, you have to understand what a feather does for him every time he takes flight. A feather is not a simple structure. Under magnification, a single flight feather reveals a system of interlocking microscopic barbs and barbules, tiny hooks that zip adjacent strands together into a continuous surface. When those barbs are aligned and locked, the feather functions as it was designed to: rigid enough to generate lift, flexible enough to absorb force, sealed enough to trap air and repel water, which means every gap in a feather is a gap the bird cannot afford. Every disrupted barb is a failure point in the surface that keeps it alive, and those gaps are forming constantly, every time it moves. Every time a bird moves through air, through vegetation, against another bird, against the sides of a nest, those microscopic hooks get disrupted. The barbs separate. The continuous surface develops gaps, and a feather with gaps does not perform the way a feather without gaps does. Research on feather degradation and flight performance has found that damage to a primary flight feather can reduce a bird's maximum flight speed by a measurable percentage with each affected feather. The number most commonly cited in field research is significant. A single damaged primary can reduce escape velocity by up to 15 to 30%, depending on the species and the extent of the damage. And the cardinal at your feeder has been living with that calculation, running in the background of every moment it exists. What preening actually does is restore the feather structure. The beak does not clean the feather in any meaningful way. What it does is rezip the barbs. The same interlocking hook system that gets disrupted during normal activity gets realigned when the beak runs along the feather shaft from base to tip. The gaps close. The surface becomes continuous again. The aerodynamic properties of the feather are restored to something close to their original specification. But researchers found something they didn't expect. The beak alone cannot do everything. Most birds, including cardinals, have a uropygial gland, also called the preen gland, located at the base of the tail. During preening, the bird periodically touches its beak to this gland and then transfers the oil it produces to the feathers being worked. This oil does several things simultaneously. It conditions the feather structure, it provides a degree of waterproofing, and in some species, it contains compounds that inhibit the bacteria and fungi that degrade feather material over time. The preening session you are watching is not one behavior, it is a maintenance protocol. Mechanical realignment combined with chemical treatment, running on every feather in a specific sequence that experienced observers can actually track. The sequence matters more than most people realize. A bird does not preen randomly. Research on preening order in songbirds has documented consistent patterns. Birds typically begin with the feathers they can access most easily and work toward the more difficult areas, the head and neck, which the bird cannot reach with its own beak, get preened through a different mechanism. The bird rubs these areas against a branch or uses its foot to scratch through the feathers. A full preening session for a bird the size of a cardinal typically takes between 15 and 25 minutes when performed completely, long enough that most people who glance out a window and see a bird preening, assume it is a passing moment, rather than what it actually is, a lengthy, structured procedure the bird is committed to finishing, which means the bird outside your window, right now, is running a systematic maintenance protocol across its entire surface, checking, realigning, treating, and moving to the next section with a thoroughness that most people never notice because the individual movements look repetitive and inconsequential. Each one is not inconsequential. Each pass of the beak is closing gaps in a surface that determines whether this bird can outfly the hawk that will appear at some point today, tomorrow, or the day after. There is a second dimension to this that almost nobody thinks about, and it connects directly to what you are watching at your feeder. Feathers are not permanent. They degrade over time regardless of how carefully they are maintained. Bacteria, UV exposure, mechanical wear, all of it takes a toll on feather structure that preening can slow, but not permanently prevent. This is why birds molt, the complete or partial replacement of the feather coat on a schedule that varies by species. Most people spend years watching birds and never know this is what has been happening. For many songbirds, including cardinals, the primary molt happens once a year, typically in late summer, after breeding season. Late summer is not a random choice either. By that point in the year, breeding is finished. The demands on the bird's energy reserves have dropped, and the days are still warm enough that molting, which requires significant metabolic resources, does not compete with the added burden of surviving cold. Timing the molt for the one stretch of the year when energy is most available is itself another layer of the same constant calculation that governs everything else a bird does. And during active molt, when new feathers are growing and old ones are being shed, the bird is operating with a temporarily compromised flight surface. This is the period when the bird at your feeder is most vulnerable. The molt feathers are not a cosmetic issue. They are a performance issue. A cardinal in active molt is slower and less maneuverable than a cardinal with a complete fresh coat, and it knows this. Molting birds show measurably increased vigilance, spend more time near cover, and reduce their time in exposed feeding positions compared to birds with complete plumage. Most songbirds molt in a specific sequence designed to minimize this vulnerability, losing and replacing one or two primary feathers at a time on each wing in a symmetrical pattern so the bird retains enough intact flight surface to escape a predator throughout the entire process. This is different from what happens in waterfowl, many of which lose all their flight feathers simultaneously and cannot fly at all for several weeks. A cardinal never has that luxury of safety. It is always flying, always vulnerable, always managing a partial deficit rather than a complete one. The molt is not a pause in survival. It is survival, running a harder version of its usual calculation. The last thing worth understanding about preening is what it tells you about the bird doing it. A bird that is preening in your yard is not distracted. It has not let its guard down. The preening behavior in songbirds is designed to be interruptible. The bird pauses, scans the environment, resumes, pauses again. What looks like a relaxed grooming session is actually a behavior running on a continuous background threat assessment loop. But the fact that the bird is preening at all tells you something specific about how it has categorized the space it is in. Preening requires a bird to take its attention partially away from the environment, not fully, but enough that the behavior only occurs in locations the bird has assessed as sufficiently safe to perform maintenance. The cardinal preening in your yard has decided your yard is safe enough to maintain its survival equipment in. That is not a casual decision. That is the bird having run its assessment, reviewed the accumulated data about your yard and the humans in it, and concluded that the risk level is low enough to spend time on something that requires partial distraction. This is worth sitting with For a moment, a bird spends every day of its life avoiding vulnerability in every form it can control. And then, in your yard specifically, it voluntarily accepts a version of that vulnerability, not because the environment has become less dangerous in any absolute sense, but because it has run enough data on this particular space, and on you specifically, to conclude the trade-off is worth it. That conclusion is revised constantly. A new object near the feeder, a change in your routine, a stranger appearing where you normally stand. Any of it can reset the calculation and pull the preening sessions back to somewhere else, somewhere the bird still fully controls, which means every preening session you have ever watched in your yard was also a vote of confidence, a small, silent, easily overlooked vote, but real. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched a bird preen and wondered what it was actually doing? I want to hear about it. I read every single one. Subscribe to Bird Sense, and if you want to understand what else your cardinal has been doing in your yard that you were never taught to read, that video is right there waiting for you.